Sometimes the wilderness doesn't just test a man's survival skills, it tests his soul. In the shadow of Devil's Ridge, where ancient Douglas firs pierce the Washington sky like cathedral spires, Marcus Bear Thornfield had made peace with solitude. 8 years of self-imposed exile in these unforgiving Cascade peaks had taught him that some guilt runs deeper than mountain roots, and some mistakes echo longer than wolf howls across moonlit valleys. But on this storm-lashed October morning, consciousness returned to him, not in his familiar cabin, but at the bottom of a 40-foot ravine with broken ribs and blood pooling beneath him on the granite. The fall should have killed him. The hypothermia should have finished what gravity started. Instead, he found himself surrounded by 5 creatures that shouldn't exist. Massive black wolves with amber eyes that held far too much intelligence, each wearing a silver medallion that caught the pale dawn light. Bear had spent decades in these mountains. He knew every species, every track, every natural law. But these wolves defied everything he understood about the wild. They didn't hunt him, didn't fear him, didn't flee. They simply watched, as if waiting for something only they understood. What could 5 impossible wolves want with a broken man who'd already lost everything that mattered? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The nearest wolf sat close enough that Bear could see his own reflection in its amber eyes. A broken man with silver beard matted in blood, his weathered face pale as morning frost. His ribs screamed with each shallow breath, and the metallic taste in his mouth told him the internal damage was worse than he'd hoped. 8 years of mountain solitude had taught him to read predators. A wolf's body language revealed everything: the tilt of ears, the position of tail, the tension in haunches ready to spring. But these 5 remained motionless as carved stone, their massive frames defying every fact he knew about Pacific Northwest wildlife. Black wolves didn't exist here. Hell, wolves barely existed here at all. The medallion around the nearest wolf's neck swayed slightly in the mountain breeze. Even through the haze of pain and shock, Bear could make out the engraving Zera Chen. The name hit him like another 40-foot fall. Not possible. Bear closed his eyes, counted to 10, opened them again. The wolves remained. The medallion remained. The name that had haunted his dreams for 8 years remained etched in silver, hanging from the neck of an impossible creature in an impossible situation. His left hand found solid granite beneath him, slick with morning condensation and his own blood. The ravine walls rose steep on both sides, creating a natural amphitheater where sound seemed to gather and hold. No wind reached him here, 40 feet below the ridge trail where he'd been checking his trap lines, when the storm-slicked rock betrayed him. The storm had passed, leaving behind that crystalline silence unique to high mountain dawns. But the quiet felt wrong, charged with expectation. Even the usual morning chorus of mountain birds remained absent, as if they knew something unnatural occupied this hidden space. Bear tried to shift position and gasped as fire shot through his torso. Definitely broken ribs, possibly punctured lung. His right ankle throbbed with each heartbeat, sprained or worse. Blood loss and hypothermia had him teetering on the edge of shock. In his condition, the 3-mile hike back to his cabin might as well be 300. He'd survived worse. The mountains had tested him plenty over the years, during his ranger days and since. But this felt different. This felt orchestrated. The wolf, bearing Sarah's name, tilted its massive head, studying him with an intelligence that raised the hair on his arms. Behind it, the other 4 remained equally still, equally watchful. Bear forced himself to focus on their medallions, dreading what he might find but needing to know. Michael Torres, Jennifer Wright, David Huang, Kevin Morrison. The 5 names that had driven him from civilization, the 5 hikers he'd failed to bring home from these very mountains 8 years ago, the 5 deaths that ended his career, his marriage, and any belief he'd once held in his own competence. Bear's vision blurred, and for a moment he couldn't tell if tears or blood clouded his sight. "This isn't real," he whispered to the wolves. "You're not real." The Sarah wolf's ears twitched at his voice. She, He somehow knew it was female, though he couldn't explain how, rose smoothly to her feet. Her size became even more apparent standing. She'd top 100 pounds easy, larger than any wolf he'd encountered in 30 years of wilderness work. She took one deliberate step toward him, then another. Bear's training screamed at him to make himself large, to shout, to establish dominance. But his body wouldn't cooperate, and something deeper than training told him it wouldn't matter anyway. These weren't ordinary predators following ordinary rules. Sarah Wolf stopped just beyond arm's reach and lowered her head, amber eyes never leaving his face. The medallion swayed hypnotically, catching fragments of sunlight that had begun filtering down into the ravine. This close, Bear could see the craftsmanship in the silver disc, hand-engraved expensive work. Not some trinket, but something made with care and intention. "What do you want?" he asked aloud, his voice echoing off granite walls. As if his words triggered some prearranged signal, all 5 wolves turned their heads in unison toward the narrow end of the ravine, where a gap between boulders led deeper into the mountain's hidden geography. Sarah Wolf looked back at him once, then began walking in that direction with fluid, purposeful strides. The others followed, single file, moving with synchronized precision that belonged in a nature documentary about pack hunting, not in the reality of a broken man bleeding at the bottom of a ravine. They stopped at the gap and turned back toward him, waiting. Bear understood, even as his rational mind rejected what his eyes told him. They wanted him to follow. 5 impossible wolves wearing the names of his greatest failure wanted to lead him somewhere deeper into terrain that didn't appear on any topographical map he'd ever studied. The smart play was obvious. Stay put, hope his emergency whistle could summon help before hypothermia or internal bleeding finished him. But as Bear stared at those 5 pairs of amber eyes, he realized his old life's rules might no longer apply. The mountains, it seemed, weren't finished testing him yet. The smart play had always been Bear's specialty. 30 years of search and rescue work didn't just teach you mountain survival, it hammered caution into your bones until risk assessment became as automatic as breathing. Check your gear twice, trust your rope, never venture beyond your planned route without telling someone where you'd gone. Those rules had kept him alive through avalanche seasons, whiteout blizzards, and rescues that pushed the boundaries of human endurance. They'd made him the ranger other rangers called when situations turned impossible. Marcus Bear Thornfield had been the man who brought people home from mountains that wanted to keep them. Until 8 years ago, when the smart play hadn't been smart enough. Bear studied the 5 wolves waiting at the gap between boulders, their amber eyes reflecting patience that felt eternal. The rational part of his mind catalogued his injuries with clinical precision. 3 broken ribs on his left side, possible internal bleeding, sprained right ankle, mild hypothermia setting in. His emergency whistle hung from a lanyard around his neck. 3 sharp blasts would carry for miles in this terrain. Rangers still patrolled these mountains, though not the ones he'd trained. Someone would come. But the nearest maintained trail lay 2 ridges over, and the October weather had driven most hikers to lower elevations weeks ago. Even if someone heard his signal, reaching this hidden ravine would take hours. Hours he might not have, bleeding internally onto granite that had swallowed countless other men who'd made one wrong step. The Sarah Wolf took a single step back toward him, head tilted in what looked disturbingly like concern. The medallion caught morning light, transforming Sarah's engraved name into a silver beacon that made Bear's chest tighten with familiar guilt. He knew that guilt better than his own reflection. It had been his constant companion since the morning he'd emerged from these mountains alone, leaving behind 5 young hikers who'd trusted him to keep them safe. The guilt had cost him his ranger badge, his marriage to Linda, his house in Cascade Falls. It had driven him to this self-imposed exile in a 1-room cabin miles from the nearest neighbor, where the only voices he heard belonged to wind and water. The cabin represented everything he had left. Not much by most standards. A wood stove, a narrow bed, shelves lined with wilderness survival guides and dog-eared novels he'd read dozens of times. No electricity, no phone, no internet. Water came from a spring he'd diverted through PVC pipe. Heat came from deadfall he split by hand each autumn. It wasn't the life he'd planned. Once, he'd commanded a search and rescue unit, owned a house with Linda where they'd talked about having kids someday. He'd been invited to barbecues and birthday parties, had friends who called him by his first name instead of maintaining the careful distance that tragedy demands. But the cabin had become sanctuary. Within its log walls, he didn't have to see the mixture of pity and blame in former colleagues' eyes. He didn't have to field reporters' questions about the Thornfield Five, as they'd been dubbed by newspapers hungry for wilderness tragedy. He didn't have to explain how a ranger with his experience could lose an entire group to a storm that hadn't even been forecasted as severe. Most importantly, in the cabin's isolation, he couldn't fail anyone else. Bear's daily routine had crystallized over 8 years into something approaching meditation. Rise before dawn, check the spring, split kindling, tend his small garden during growing season, preserve what food he could. Maintain his trap lines, not for survival, though the meat helped, but because the work kept his hands busy and his mind focused on immediate problems. Twice monthly, he hiked to Cascade Falls for supplies, a journey that required 2 days round trip. The general store clerk, a kid named Tommy, who'd been maybe 10 when Bear left civilization, treated him with polite wariness. Tommy took Bear's cash for beans and flour and batteries, asked no questions, volunteered no conversation beyond what necessity required. It wasn't much of a life, but it was his. Predictable, safe, contained. The wolves hadn't moved from their position at the gap, waiting with the patience of creatures who understood that time moved differently in the mountains, that human decisions required more deliberation than instinct provided. Bear's hand found the emergency whistle around his neck. 3 blasts, simple, smart, safe. But as he touched the metal, Sarah Chen's name glinted from the nearest wolf's medallion, and 8 years of carefully constructed isolation cracked like ice under spring sun. He remembered Sarah's laugh when she'd spotted a pileated woodpecker on their first day, remembered how she'd helped Jennifer with her pack when the older woman struggled with elevation, remembered the trust in her eyes when the storm hit and she'd looked to him for answers he didn't have. The wolves waited, amber eyes reflecting a question Bear suddenly realized he'd been avoiding his entire exile. What if the mountains weren't finished with him? What if his greatest failure had only been the beginning of something he didn't yet understand? 3 sharp blasts from his whistle would end this madness. Bear's fingers tightened around the metal, feeling its familiar weight, a weight that had summoned help through countless emergencies during his ranger days. The sound would carry across the ridges, echoing off granite faces until it reached someone, somewhere, who might still remember their duty to answer distress calls. But as he raised the whistle toward his lips, the Sarah wolf moved. Not threatening, nothing about her posture suggested aggression. Instead, she approached with the deliberate care of a medic approaching a trauma victim, each step measured and purposeful. When she reached him, she lowered her massive head and gently nudged the whistle from his grasp with her muzzle. The metal clattered against stone, the sound unnaturally sharp in the ravine's hushed atmosphere. Bear stared at the wolf, whose amber eyes held an intelligence that made his skin crawl. She backed away 2 steps and sat, never breaking eye contact, as if waiting for him to understand some fundamental truth. "You don't want me calling for help," Bear whispered, the words feeling strange in his mouth. Speaking to a wolf, speaking to an impossibility wearing a dead woman's name. The Sarah wolf's ears flicked forward once, acknowledgement or coincidence Bear couldn't tell. But the other 4 wolves had moved closer during the interaction, forming a loose semicircle around him, not threatening, protective almost, like a search and rescue team positioning themselves around an injured hiker. The comparison sent ice through his veins. Bear forced himself to look at each medallion again, reading the names that had haunted every sleepless night for 8 years. Sarah Chen, 26, graduate student in environmental science who'd saved for 2 years to afford the guided wilderness trek. Michael Torres, 31, software engineer from Seattle taking his first real vacation since his divorce. Jennifer Wright, 54, recently retired teacher celebrating her freedom with the adventure she'd always promised herself. David Huang, 28, photographer hoping to capture images for his first gallery showing. Kevin Morrison, 23, recent college graduate treating himself to one last adventure before starting his corporate job. Bear remembered them all, their faces, their voices, their individual quirks and fears and dreams they'd shared around the campfire, those first 3 nights before the weather turned. He remembered Jennifer's stories about her students, Sarah's passion for conservation work, Michael's quiet jokes that made the group laugh despite their exhaustion. He remembered the exact moment he'd lost them. The storm had come from nowhere, not the gradual build-up his experience had taught him to read, but a sudden, vicious assault that transformed familiar terrain into an alien landscape of whipping snow and zero visibility. They'd been on Devil's Ridge, the same area where he'd fallen yesterday, following a route he'd guided dozens of times without incident. The wind had hit them like a physical blow, strong enough to knock Kevin off his feet. Bear had ordered immediate shelter, but in the whiteout conditions, they'd become separated. One moment the group had been together, roped and following his lead. The next he'd been alone in howling chaos, shouting names that the storm swallowed without echo. He'd found their camp the next morning, after the weather cleared. 5 empty sleeping bags in a partial lean-to they'd managed to construct before. Before what? The investigation had never determined exactly what happened. No bodies were ever recovered. It was as if the mountains had simply claimed them, the way mountains sometimes did. Now those same mountains had sent the names back to him, carried by creatures that shouldn't exist, in circumstances that defied every rational explanation his scientific mind could construct. The Michael wolf rose from his haunches and padded to Bear's left side, close enough that Bear could feel body heat radiating through thick black fur. This close, the wolf's size became even more apparent, easily 120 pounds of muscle and predatory grace. But instead of the threat Bear's training told him to expect, the wolf simply lay down beside him, providing warmth against the morning chill that had begun seeping into his bones. One by one, the other wolves followed suit. Jennifer and David flanked his right side, while Kevin positioned himself near Bear's feet. Sarah remained directly in front of him, amber eyes never wavering from his face. The warmth was immediate and profound. Where moments before Bear had felt hypothermia's familiar creep, the subtle numbness in his extremities, the drowsiness that preceded unconsciousness, now heat flowed back into his core. His shivering stopped, his breathing steadied. They were keeping him alive. The realization hit him with the force of avalanche. Whatever these creatures were, wherever they'd come from, they needed him functional. This wasn't chance encounter or hypothermic hallucination. This was rescue. But rescue for what purpose? Sarah Wolf rose again and took several steps toward the gap between boulders, then looked back at him with unmistakable expectation. The message was clear. Time to move. Time to choose. Bear's hand fell away from where his whistle lay against cold stone. His old life, his careful isolation, his predictable routine, all of it suddenly felt as distant as the civilization he'd abandoned 8 years ago. The mountains had given him a choice, but perhaps choice was an illusion. Perhaps this moment had been inevitable since the morning he'd emerged from Devil's Ridge alone. Whatever waited beyond that gap, it held answers to questions he'd been too afraid to ask. The wolves began to move. Bear watched the wolves gather at the gap between boulders, their synchronized movement making his broken ribs ache with each shallow breath. The smart thing, the Bear Thornfield thing, was to stay exactly where he was until rescue arrived. But as he stared at those 5 medallions glinting in the morning light, every instinct that had kept him alive for 62 years screamed warnings he couldn't ignore. This is how people die in the mountains, he thought, fingers brushing against granite slick with his own blood. They follow mysterious animals into unmapped terrain with broken ribs and no backup plan. He'd seen the aftermath too many times during his ranger days. Hikers who chased wounded deer off established trails, climbers who pursued shortcuts through unfamiliar couloirs, hunters who followed elk tracks into whiteout conditions. The mountains collected their bodies with patient indifference, and Bear had been the one pulling corpses from crevasses, explaining to families how their loved ones had made that one fatal decision to abandon safety for curiosity. The Sarah wolf looked back at him from the gap, amber eyes holding something that might have been disappointment or pity. Bear couldn't decide which possibility disturbed him more. "I'm not following you anywhere," he said aloud, his voice echoing off granite walls. "I don't care what kind of fever dream this is." But even as the words left his mouth, Bear knew he was lying to himself. The warmth from their bodies had saved his life. He could feel strength returning to his extremities, his core temperature stabilizing. Without their intervention, hypothermia would have claimed him within hours. That wasn't hallucination or coincidence. That was deliberate rescue by creatures that understood his condition better than he did. The question that terrified him most wasn't what these wolves were, but why they needed him alive. Bear tried to shift position and gasped as fire shot through his torso. His right ankle had swollen inside his boot, and each movement sent fresh waves of agony through his chest. Even if the wolves meant no harm, following them in his condition would be suicide. The terrain beyond that gap could be anything. Cliff faces, unstable scree, river crossings that would finish what the fall had started. He thought of his cabin, 3 miles away through familiar forest. His wood stove would be cold now, but he could rebuild the fire. His medical kit contained enough supplies to stabilize his injuries until the next supply run to Cascade Falls: hot soup, clean bandages, his own bed instead of granite that leached heat from his bones. Safety, isolation. The carefully constructed life that asked nothing from him except continued breathing. "But they found you anyway," a voice in his mind whispered. 8 years of hiding, and the mountains sent them right to you. The Jennifer wolf padded back from the gap, her movements fluid despite her massive size. She stopped beside Bear and lowered her head, pressing her muzzle gently against his injured ribs. The touch should have sent him screaming with pain, but instead, a strange warmth spread through his chest. Not healing, his ribs remained broken, but something that made the pain manageable, distant. "Stop it," Bear whispered, but made no move to push her away. "Whatever this is, just stop." The wolf's amber eyes reflected depths that reminded him of Sarah Chen's expression when she'd asked about his years as a ranger. The same curiosity, the same trust that he knew what he was doing, the trust that had gotten her killed. All 5 of them had trusted him. They'd paid premium rates for his guide services, believing his reputation would keep them safe in mountains he knew better than his own reflection. They'd followed his route recommendations, his camp selections, his weather assessments. When the storm hit Devil's Ridge, they'd looked to him for leadership even as wind tried to tear them from the mountain. He'd failed them completely. Now the mountains had sent them back, wearing the shapes of apex predators, offering him another chance to lead them into unknown terrain. Another opportunity to make the wrong decision at the critical moment. Bear closed his eyes and saw their faces around the campfire. Jennifer laughing at Michael's story about his disastrous first camping trip, Sarah and David comparing notes about wilderness photography, Kevin sketching in his journal with the focused intensity of someone trying to capture every detail of an experience he might never repeat. They'd been alive then, trusting, ready for the adventure he'd promised them. When he opened his eyes, all 5 wolves had moved closer, forming a protective circle around his broken body. Their breathing created small clouds in the cold air, the only movement in the ravine's supernatural stillness. Waiting, patient as mountains themselves. The gap between boulders yawned like a mouth, leading deeper into the mountain's hidden anatomy. Beyond it lay terrain that didn't exist on any map, questions he'd spent 8 years avoiding, and possibilities that terrified him more than dying alone on granite stone. Bear looked at his emergency whistle, still glinting where it had fallen. 3 sharp blasts. Safety, home. Or he could trust the mountains one more time. Bear's fingers trembled as he reached for the whistle. metal cold against his palm. For 8 years, this moment had lived in his nightmares. Another group looking to him for leadership, another chance to guide people he cared about into death. The smart choice lay gleaming in his hand. 3 blasts. Wait for rescue. Return to his cabin and the safe predictability of isolation. But as he lifted the whistle toward his lips, Sarah Wolf stepped closer, not threatening, pleading. Her amber eyes held an intelligence that stripped away every rational explanation he'd constructed. This wasn't hypothermia or head trauma or grief-induced hallucination. This was real, and these creatures needed something from him that only he could provide, the same way 5 hikers had needed him 8 years ago. Bear's hands stilled. In the supernatural quiet of the ravine, he could hear his own heartbeat, rapid and irregular against his broken ribs. Fear, yes, but something else underneath it. Something he'd buried so deep he'd forgotten its name. Purpose. You want me to follow you, he whispered to the wolves. Into terrain I don't know, in condition I might not survive. His voice cracked. Just like before. The Sarah Wolf moved to his side and pressed her massive shoulder against his arm, not pushing, just contact. Warmth flowed between them, and Bear felt something shift inside his chest. Not his injuries, but something deeper. The wall he'd built around his heart, brick by careful brick, developed its first crack in 8 years. These creatures had saved his life, when they could have simply watched him die. They'd shared their body heat, somehow eased his pain, waited with infinite patience for him to make his choice. Whatever they were, they trusted him despite his history of catastrophic failure. Maybe it was time to trust them back. Bear set the whistle on the granite beside him with deliberate finality. The metallic clink echoed off stone walls like a door closing on his old life. "All right," he said, voice steadier than he felt. "But I need help getting up." The wolves moved with coordinated precision that made his ranger instincts tingle. Jennifer Wolf positioned herself on his left side, while Michael took his right, both lowering themselves so Bear could use their backs for support. David and Kevin flanked them protectively as Bear struggled to his feet, every movement sending fresh agony through his torso. Standing required 3 attempts and left him gasping, black spots dancing at the edges of his vision. But the wolves held steady, their combined strength keeping him upright when his own legs threatened to buckle. When his breathing stabilized, Sarah Wolf moved toward the gap between boulders. Bear took his first step away from safety. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, his broken ribs grinding with each movement, his swollen ankle threatening to give way entirely. But the wolves adjusted their pace to match his, Jennifer and Michael staying close enough that he could lean on them when necessary. They moved as a unit through the narrow gap, leaving behind the familiar geometry of the ravine for terrain that shouldn't exist. Beyond the boulders lay a hidden valley that defied everything Bear knew about these mountains. Ancient pines towered overhead, their branches creating a cathedral ceiling that filtered morning light into golden columns. The air itself felt different, warmer, somehow charged with energy that made his skin prickle. A stream meandered through the valley floor, its voice harmonizing with wind through branches in music that belonged to no earthly forest. This place wasn't on any topographical map. Bear had spent 40 years learning every ridge and valley in a 50-mile radius, but this hidden sanctuary existed in geographical impossibility. The ravine where he'd fallen should have dead-ended against the mountain's face. Instead, it opened into wilderness that predated human cartography. "Where are we?" Bear asked, though he expected no answer. Sarah Wolf looked back at him, and for just a moment, Bear could swear he saw Sarah Chen's smile in the creature's expression. Then she turned and led them deeper into the impossible valley. Each step carried Bear further from everything he'd known, everything he'd used to define himself for 8 years. His cabin grew more distant with every painful footfall. His carefully maintained isolation crumbled like frost before sunrise. The fear that had driven him into exile couldn't follow him here. This place operated by different rules, older than human understanding. Behind them, the gap between boulders shimmered and sealed itself with mountain silence. No path remained back to Bear's old life. The whistle lay abandoned on cold granite, its promise of rescue now meaningless. There was only forward now, into mystery that wore familiar names and offered second chances to men who'd convinced themselves they deserved neither forgiveness nor redemption. The wolves moved deeper into impossible wilderness, and Bear Thornfield followed. His broken body carried by trust he'd thought died with 5 young hikers on a ridge that had claimed everything he'd once been. The valley's warmth embraced Bear like a living thing, but with each painful step deeper into the impossible wilderness, new challenges revealed themselves. What had seemed like sanctuary from a distance transformed into terrain designed to test every limit of his broken body. The stream Sarah Wolf led them toward looked deceptively peaceful until they reached its banks. The water ran black as obsidian, reflecting no light despite the golden sunshine filtering through ancient pines. Its voice had changed too. What sounded like gentle babbling from afar became whispers in languages Bear didn't recognize, words that seemed to speak his name. Sarah Wolf paused at the water's edge and looked back at him with those amber eyes that held too much intelligence. The message was clear. They had to cross. "You've got to be kidding me," Bear muttered, studying the stream. Maybe 20 feet across, but the current looked stronger than it appeared, and he could see no bottom through the black water. In his condition, a fall would likely be his last. There has to be another way. The wolf simply waited. Bear tested his weight on his injured ankle and nearly collapsed. Jennifer Wolf immediately pressed against his side, offering support, but crossing moving water while dependent on creatures that might disappear at any moment struck him as monumentally stupid. Then again, everything about this situation defied rational thought. As if sensing his hesitation, David Wolf padded along the bank until he found something Bear had missed. A series of moss-covered stones forming a natural bridge across the narrowest point. Not easy, but possible. Maybe. "Okay," Bear breathed. "Okay, we can work with this." The crossing became a careful choreography of trust and balance. Jennifer Wolf led the way, testing each stone before allowing Bear to follow. Michael took position downstream, while Kevin and David flanked the makeshift bridge. Sarah Wolf stayed beside Bear, moving in perfect synchronization with his halting progress. Halfway across, Bear's ankle gave out. He pitched sideways toward the black water, broken ribs screaming as he fought to catch himself. Sarah Wolf moved like lightning, her powerful shoulder catching him before he could fall. For a heartbeat they teetered together on wet stone, while the dark current whispered hungrily below. Then Michael Wolf appeared on his other side, and together they guided him safely to the far bank. Bear collapsed onto solid ground, gasping. "Thanks," he wheezed. "I owe you one." Sarah Wolf made a sound deep in her throat. Not quite a growl, but something that conveyed unmistakable amusement. Almost like she was saying just one. Beyond the stream, the valley floor began to rise toward what looked like a natural amphitheater carved into the mountainside. Ancient petroglyphs covered the stone walls, symbols that seemed to shift and change when Bear wasn't looking directly at them. At the amphitheater's center stood a circle of 7 standing stones, each twice Bear's height and carved with intricate patterns that hurt to look at for too long. But it was what waited among the stones that stopped Bear cold. A figure sat cross-legged in the circle's center, human in shape but wrong in ways that made Bear's vision blur when he tried to focus. Neither young nor old, neither clearly male nor female, wearing clothes that might have been buckskin or might have been shadow. When the figure raised its head, Bear found himself looking into eyes that held the depth of geological time. "Marcus Thornfield," the figure said, voice carrying harmonics that resonated in his bones. "The mountain's child returns." Bear's throat went dry. "Who are you?" "I'm what remains when the stories are forgotten and only the mountain remembers." The figure rose with fluid grace. "I am the keeper of debts unpaid, the guardian of second chances rarely earned." The wolves arranged themselves around Bear protectively, but their posture suggested reverence rather than threat. This entity, whatever it was, commanded their respect. The 5 you failed to save, the figure continued, offered themselves to preserve the balance you disrupted. Their lives became the foundation for this sanctuary, their names the keys that would one day call you home. I don't understand. Bear's voice cracked. They died because of my mistakes. Because I couldn't. Because you were meant to bring them here. But your fear chose the easier path. The figure stepped closer, and Bear caught sense of pine smoke and winter storms. The mountain tried to claim them that night on Devil's Ridge. You were supposed to guide them through the crossing, to safety in this place between worlds. Instead, you led them into ordinary death. I was supposed to... Bear staggered, the implications hitting him like a physical blow. You're saying I was supposed to know about this place? That their deaths were... preventable? Yes. The figure's expression showed neither condemnation nor forgiveness. You were chosen as guide for more than your knowledge of trails, Marcus Thornfield. You were born with the sight, the ability to find paths others cannot see, but you buried that gift beneath rationality and maps, choosing the safe wilderness over the true one. Bear looked at the wolves surrounding him, understanding finally dawning. These weren't supernatural creatures. They were his guides, helping him find the way he should have seen 8 years ago. The figure extended one hand toward him. Now you have another choice to make. Bear stared at the outstretched hand, every instinct screaming conflicting warnings. The figure's words had shattered his understanding of that night on Devil's Ridge, replacing familiar guilt with something far more devastating. The knowledge that his failures had cosmic consequences. What choice? Bear's voice barely carried above the whisper of wind through ancient pines. The same choice you faced 8 years ago, but with clearer sight. The figure's hand remained steady, patient as stone. Will you guide them home, or will fear claim you both? Both? Bear's broken ribs constricted around suddenly insufficient lungs. I'm the only one here who's still. Look deeper, Marcus Thornfield. The command hit him like physical force. Bear's vision shifted, as if someone had adjusted the focus on reality itself. The wolves surrounding him wavered, their massive forms becoming translucent. Through Sarah Wolf's amber eyes, Bear saw Sarah Chen herself, not as she'd been in death, but trapped somewhere between worlds, her essence bound to lupine form by forces beyond human comprehension. All 5 of them, still here, still depending on him. They've been waiting, the figure continued relentlessly, suspended between life and whatever comes after, because their guide failed to see the path that would have saved them. The mountain offered mercy, transformation instead of death, but only if their guardian could eventually find the courage to complete what he started. Bear's knees buckled. Jennifer Wolf, Jennifer, caught him before he could fall, and through her touch he felt her presence. Faint, but unmistakably real. The woman who'd laughed at campfire stories, now locked in predator form because he'd been too blind to see sanctuary when it stood before him. 8 years, Bear whispered. They've been like this for 8 years. Time moves differently here. For them, it's been moments. But those moments are ending. The figure's expression grew urgent. The mountain's patience has limits. Guide them to the final crossing tonight, or lose them forever to the void between worlds. I don't know how. The words tore from Bear's throat. You say I was born with some gift, but I've never seen anything but ordinary trails and ordinary mountains. I'm just a broken-down ranger who got people killed. You survived a 40-foot fall that should have been fatal. Bear blinked, thrown by the apparent non-sequitur. I got lucky, landed in deep snow. There was no snow in that ravine until you needed it. The figure stepped closer, and Bear caught that scent of pine smoke again, familiar somehow, like childhood memories just beyond reach. The mountain cushioned your fall because it needed you alive. Your lucky survival was the first sign of returning sight. Bear remembered the strange softness of his landing, how the snow had seemed impossibly deep for October weather. He'd attributed it to shock, to the peculiarities of mountain microclimates. But looking back with different eyes, the wolves found you because you called them, the figure pressed. Not with voice, but with the gift you've spent decades denying. You've always been able to see paths others miss, It's why you were such an effective ranger, why clients requested you specifically. You thought it was just experience and intuition, but it was so much more. Sarah Wolf pressed closer, and Bear felt her desperation through their connection. Not the animal's need, but Sarah Chen's, the young photographer who'd trusted him to keep her safe, who'd followed his lead into a storm that should have been survivable if he'd known where to look for shelter. "What is this place?" Bear asked, though he was beginning to understand. "A sanctuary as old as the mountains themselves, a crossing point between the world you know and the greater wilderness that exists alongside it." The figure gestured toward the standing stones with their eye-watering carvings. Indigenous peoples knew of such places, marked them, guarded them. But as the old knowledge faded, the crossings became hidden, accessible only to those born with the sight. "And you think I know what you are, Marcus Thornfield. The question is whether you'll accept it in time to save them." Bear looked around the impossible valley, at the black stream that whispered names, at the petroglyphs that moved when observed peripherally. This place operated by rules older than human civilization, where the boundary between physical and spiritual blurred into meaninglessness. Here, the dead could wear living forms, time could stretch or contract, and a man's deepest failures could offer chances at redemption. But redemption required action. "The crossing," Bear said slowly. "Where is it?" The figure smiled for the first time, an expression that held both warmth and terrible sadness. "You already know. You've always known. Trust the sight you were born with instead of the maps you learned to follow." Bear closed his eyes and felt something shift inside his perception. When he opened them again, the valley looked different, layered with possibilities, threaded with paths visible only to peripheral vision. And there, beyond the standing stones where reality grew thin, he saw it, the way forward, the choice that would define everything. Bear stared at the shimmering threshold beyond the standing stones, his newfound sight revealing what maps could never show, a doorway between worlds, ancient beyond measure, waiting for him to step through with 5 souls depending on his courage. The path to it looked simple enough, 50 yards across relatively level ground. But Bear could see the layers now, the way reality bent and folded around the crossing point. Each step would carry him deeper into forces that cared nothing for human frailty. His broken body, already pushed past its limits, would have to endure trials that existed outside normal physics. "What happens if I can't make it?" Bear asked. "What happens to them if I fail again?" The figure's expression grew grave. Then they fade completely. No afterlife, no peace, simply nothing. The void between worlds claims them permanently. Sarah Wolf pressed against Bear's leg. And through their connection, he felt her absolute trust. After 8 years trapped between life and death, she still believed he could save them. The weight of that faith nearly crushed him. "Time grows short," the figure warned. "The crossing opens fully only at twilight. Miss this window, and it seals for another cycle." Bear looked at the ancient sun, already beginning its descent toward the valley's rim. Maybe 4 hours of daylight remained, 4 hours to traverse 50 yards that might as well have been 50 miles, given what his enhanced sight revealed about the true nature of that seemingly simple ground. The space between here and the crossing writhed with possibility, past and present overlapping, future outcomes bleeding through like double-exposed photographs. Bear could see fragments of that night 8 years ago playing out in ghostly repetition, 5 young hikers following his lead through driving snow, trusting his expertise to keep them safe. Their faces so alive then, so hopeful. He saw other things too. Potential futures where he succeeded, where the wolves transformed back into human form and walked through the crossing to whatever waited beyond. But those visions felt fragile as spun glass, easily shattered by doubt or fear. "The sight comes with a price," the figure said, watching Bear's face contort as visions layered upon reality. "You'll experience every choice, every consequence, every path not taken. The closer you get to the crossing, the more intense it becomes. Many with the gift go mad from it." "Wonderful," Bear muttered, but he was already moving. Jennifer Wolfe positioned herself at his right side while Michael took his left, their solid presence anchoring him as the visions threatened to drag him into paralysis. His first step onto the approach sent shockwaves of pain through his ribs, but something else came with it. A displacement, as if he'd stepped slightly sideways through time. For a moment, Bear was 40 years old again, leading his first solo rescue mission, young and confident and utterly unaware of the supernatural responsibilities that came with his gift. The second step brought a different memory, childhood hiking with his grandfather, an old Salish man who'd married into Bear's family and tried to teach him about the thin places where worlds touched. Bear had dismissed those stories as folklore, choosing field guides over ancestral wisdom. "I should have listened to him," Bear gasped. Sarah Wolfe made a sound that might have been agreement. Each step forward became a battle not just against physical agony, but against the cascade of visions threatening to overwhelm his sanity. Bear saw himself from every angle: the ranger who'd saved dozens of lives, the hermit who'd hidden from responsibility, the man who'd been chosen for purposes he'd never understood. All these versions of himself existed simultaneously here, where linear time held no meaning. But worst were the visions of the hikers themselves, not just their deaths, but their lives cut short. Sarah Chen would have become a renowned photographer, her work helping protect the very wilderness where she died. Jennifer had been 3 months pregnant, carrying the child who would have grown up to broker the first meaningful climate treaty between nations. David's unfinished novel would have inspired a generation of environmental activists. All of it lost because Bear had been too rational, too grounded in conventional thinking to see the sanctuary that could have saved them. "Stop!" The figure's voice cut through his spiraling guilt. "That path leads only to madness. Focus on what is, not what was." Bear forced himself to concentrate on the present moment, the wolves surrounding him, the solid ground beneath his feet, the crossing growing larger ahead. But the visions kept coming, fragments of possibility bleeding through. Sarah Wolfe, dissolving into light as her human form emerges, whole and alive. The crossing sealing forever, as Bear collapses 10 feet short. 5 graves on a mountainside, finally empty as their occupants find peace. Bear himself, transformed by passage through the threshold into something more than human. 20 yards to go. Bear's ankle gave out completely, forcing him to lean heavily on the wolves. His ribs felt like broken glass grinding against his lungs, but through his enhanced sight, he could see the crossing responding to their approach, growing brighter, more solid, as if their combined will was calling it into full existence. The ordeal had only just begun, and already Bear wondered if any human soul could survive what lay ahead. 15 yards from the crossing, Bear's world exploded into chaos. The visions that had been bleeding through in fragments suddenly erupted like a dam bursting. Every possible timeline, every potential outcome, every choice he'd ever made crashed into his consciousness simultaneously. Bear screamed, dropping to his knees as reality fractured around him. He was 8 years old, following his grandfather through mountain trails, ignoring the old man's warnings about places where the world grew thin. He was 25, fresh out of ranger training, confidently dismissing indigenous folklore as quaint superstition. He was 42, leading 5 doomed hikers into a storm, while the sanctuary lay invisible mere miles away. He was 62, broken and failing again, all at once, all equally real. "Make it stop!" Bear clawed at his temples as the visions intensified. Through his fragmenting perception, he could see the wolves circling him frantically, their forms flickering between lupine and human. Sarah's face superimposed over Sarah Wolfe's amber eyes, her mouth moving soundlessly, trying to tell him something crucial. But he couldn't focus. The gift that was supposed to save them had become a torment beyond enduring. Bear felt his sanity beginning to crack under the assault of infinite possibility. Then the figure was beside him, one hand pressed to Bear's forehead. "You're fighting it. The sight cannot be controlled, only accepted. I can't. There's too much, because you're trying to process it linearly, Stop thinking like a human bound to singular time. See it all, accept it all, choose anyway. Bear forced himself to stop resisting the chaos. The visions continued their assault, but instead of fighting them, he let them wash through him like a tide. Past, present, future, all equally valid, all simultaneously true. He was every version of himself that had ever existed or could exist. He had saved them, he had failed them, he would save them, he would fail again. All paths were real. But only one mattered now. Standing on shaking legs, Bear took another step toward the crossing. The wolves reformed their protective circle, but he could see their lupine forms growing more transparent with each passing moment. Time was running out. 10 yards. The crossing blazed before them now, a doorway of pure possibility framed by standing stones that hummed with frequencies older than human civilization. But something was wrong. Through his enhanced sight, Bear could see the threshold beginning to fluctuate, its edges growing unstable. "What's happening?" Bear gasped. The figure's expression turned grim. "Your injuries. The crossing requires a whole guide, spirit, mind, and body united in purpose. Your broken ribs, the damage to your ankle, it's creating dissonance in the threshold frequency." Bear looked down at himself and saw the truth. Blood was seeping through his jacket from internal injuries worse than he'd realized. The 40-foot fall had done more damage than adrenaline and determination could mask. His body was failing, and with it, the crossing. 5 yards. Sarah Wolf suddenly collapsed beside him, her form flickering wildly between wolf and human. Through their connection, Bear felt her essence beginning to fragment as the unstable crossing pulled her toward the void. The other wolves were showing similar signs. Kevin Wolf's outline blurring, Jennifer Wolf's amber eyes growing dim. "No," Bear snarled, pushing forward on will alone. "Not again. Not after everything." 3 yards. 2. 1. Bear reached out toward the threshold's shimmering surface, and his hand passed through empty air. The crossing had become completely unstable, no longer solid enough to traverse. As Bear watched in horror, it began to collapse in on itself, folding away from reality like origami made of light and time. "I'm sorry," the figure said quietly. "A broken guide cannot open a stable path. The mountain gave you this chance, but your body has failed." One by one, the wolves began to fade. Bear felt their connections to him stretching, thinning, preparing to snap forever. Sarah Wolf managed to lift her head once more, looking at him with an expression of such profound forgiveness that it shattered what remained of his heart. She didn't blame him. None of them did. Even now, facing final oblivion, they trusted his intentions if not his capabilities. The crossing contracted to a pinpoint of light and winked out. Bear collapsed beside the standing stones, broken ribs finally puncturing something vital. Blood filled his mouth as the wolves dissolved around him, their essence pulled into the void between worlds. 8 years of waiting, reduced to nothing. 5 souls lost not once but twice because he couldn't be the guide they needed. In the gathering twilight, Bear lay dying among ancient stones, having come so far only to fail when it mattered most. The gift he'd been born with had shown him everything, except how to save the people who'd depended on him. The mountain's silence pressed down like a weight of centuries, and Bear finally understood the true measure of his failure.